Hey there, Hetty here. Today I'd like to chat a bit about one of the things I consider and call, rather uncharitably I admit, the low-hanging fruit of practical guides to witchcraft. There are a lot of different varietals of such fruit, of course, but as a group what they share is the capacity to increase a manuscript's word count while simultaneously contributing little of practical value. In fairness, a lot of this low-hanging fruit was at one point worthwhile. The first person to publish a complete description of all the celebrations of note on the Wheel of the Year, that person did a good thing. And so too did the people who came along thereafter to add their own unique views and build upon the ideas presented or make them more accessible. And every few years or so, somebody actually comes out with a novel take on the concept that's well worth the read. But let's be honest, at least 98% of writers that include a chapter on the Wheel of the Year could have skipped it, because they had not a single new thought to contribute to the topic, and forcing us all to read 20 pages of exposition simply to confirm that we're not going to encounter a novel idea is a waste of all of our lives. And just so we're clear, I'm sure the publishing house and their editors are as much to blame, if not more so, than the authors. I have no doubt that there are many writers out there who've tried to submit a manuscript on witchcraft with a chapter that simply said, "To learn more about the Wheel of the Year and related concepts, please see nearly any other introductory book on general witchcraft in print. To get you started, here's a list of several hundred manuscripts that all say pretty much the same thing on the topic and which are currently available for order from this publisher." And I'm just as sure that a lot of these authors were shot down by the folks with the money in the printing presses. Or the editing software, I suppose, given the era. So for the record, I'd like to say that I don't begrudge those brave members of the repetition resistance who fought and fell. There's no shame in having been bested by those wielding the red pens and the checks. But I digress. These low-hanging spiritual fruit aren't strictly informational, though. Many are practices or rituals that are billed as central or initiatory. These fruits also generally come with exercises or rituals that readers are supposed to practice, and whose instructions add about 1,000 extra words to the manuscript. Yay, only 99,000 to go. Within this category of questionable exercises encountered in the books of my youth, there are a subset that sounded super badass, but which I was either too scared to try or could, predictably, never find the right opportunity to attempt. The one that springs immediately to mind is from the book The 21 Lessons of Merlin, which is famously bullshit-filled, but which teenage me adored. I'll never forget chanting that old druidic power-raising spell high atop the quartz-shot rocks in a nearby provincial park, a chant the internet would later reveal to have been written for the 1981 film Excalibur. I still remember every bloody word of that spell, by the way, despite never having seen the film. I suppose I should watch it one day, if only to figure out just how far off my pronunciation was. Anyway, there was this one chapter where at the end the reader was basically encouraged to sprint through the woods at night using their intuition to guide them. The concept seemed super romantic to teenage me, and I totally wanted to try it, but couldn't shake the feeling that I'd almost certainly kill myself in the attempt, and that dying so stupidly would disappoint the hell out of my parents. Exercises such as these, ones necessitating a level of risk that most people simply will not accept, count as low-hanging spiritual fruit because even if the exercise did in fact hold value, nobody with an ounce of self-preservation would ever find that out. As such, they become a jaded sort of filler, disingenuous nonsense, because their utility is, at best, buried beneath a mound of insurmountable obstacles, like, for instance, the need to be able to pass a background check one day. Worse still than either infinitely repeated material or the practically impossible are those low-hanging fruit masquerading as the gateway to occult knowledge. In other words, the so-called fundamentals, for they are the fruit of lies. And yet we as a group can't help but go on about them. Again, this is true of me too. The thing is, ultimately, each of us is really talking about what has become fundamental to our own practices, whatever those may be. My fundamentals aren't precisely yours or that guy's, obviously. But I do wonder whether, really, our practices look more similar than they need to, or even than they should, because the lot of us went through the same motions when we were first starting out, did the same exercises, put stock in the same promises and warnings, and generally obeyed the same seeming authorities. To dive into this a bit more, let's use an example of what is no doubt among the top 5 most touted fundamentals of witchcraft: visualization. First off, I cannot tell you how many bloody apples I visualized. Too fucking many. Apples against a field of black, apples spinning, apples hovering between my hands, apples that grew large enough that I could stick my head into their pores, itsy bitsy little apples, apples that spontaneously grew eyes and leered at me as if to ask what my deal with apples is. I'm not remotely convinced that these so-called beginner exercises in visualization shouldn't be chucked right out the window like 99% of the time. And I say this as somebody whose practice is heavily reliant on visualization too. I'm just not of the opinion that I came away from these exercises with any more skill at visualization than I went into them with. If anything, I suspect that this sort of visualization practice interferes with a process that is more or less inherent and automatic for a good chunk of the population, by trying to make it sound or seem harder and more complicated than it really is. What did help, on the other hand, was engaging in more of the visualization that I did naturally. Immersive visualization, high-def guided daydreaming of the sort many of us did as children and hopefully continue to do as adults. From a practical standpoint, the apples were never any easier to picture for me than a person's face, than a room at the Louvre, than 100 acres of rolling hills with bunnies basking atop and thereby crushing a metric ton of apples. They were, however, utterly dull to maintain, boring in the way that a supposed challenge that isn't really tends to be. There's no advantage to stripping out 95% of the detail from one's visualizations, or the movement, or the sound, smell, touch, emotion, or purpose from the scene. So who exactly decided that holding the picture of a decontextualized foodstuff in one's mind was a natural place to begin one's conscious training in visualization? And why did I so readily jump on board and then stay the miserable course for so long? Now, not everybody is inherently good at visualization. I'm not trying to claim we're all equally adept. Hell, a small proportion of the population can't visualize anything at all, a characteristic called aphantasia. But even among those who can visualize, the ability falls along a spectrum that, to my knowledge, nobody has ever made a solid case for correlating with spiritual ability or spellcrafting success, let alone demonstrated its necessity. Nor is it obvious to what extent visualization as a term is used consistently in conversations about spellcasting technique. For my part, it's become clear over the years that the process of visualization varies from instance to instance, and over time more and more, depending on what I'm trying to achieve. In some cases, these different forms of or approaches to visualization are distinguished by differences in physical sensation. For example, one approach feels like pushing forward through the bridge of my nose and produces a sort of gentle strain on my eyes themselves that I suspect, although have never confirmed, relates to their position under the lids. The perceptual experience of this sort of visualization is distinct from the relaxed eye subgroup of visualizations that I employ more frequently. A perception that is probably at least partly attributable to the association of that gentle strain with intensity and forward movement. Likewise, the forms of visualization I employ vary in their sense of immersion, solidity, conscious control, and dissociation. And I'm quite certain none of them in particular is better across the board than the others. In the end, though, I found that the approach to visualization that comes most naturally to each of us, our default approaches, whatever they may be, is entirely adequate for everything but a handful of very specific tasks that do seem, in my hands at least, to require practice above and beyond. Do whatever comes naturally, repeatedly, to improve at that thing effortlessly. And in each of those cases, the task itself is a technique where visualization itself is the goal, rather than the means to one. Also, the fact that those techniques benefited from a slightly different approach to visualization emerged from my own playing around rather than a step-by-step program, and all differ as a result of secondary processes, like attention, or point of view, or yes, physical strain, occurring during the visualization rather than the process of picturing things itself. I've talked about some of these things before in my videos on pathworking and mental conceptualizations of self, for example, particularly the one about dissociation. Visualization is a bit like painting, I think. No individual artistic style is inherently better suited to depicting any given concept or item, although each certainly flavors the final representation. Nor can these myriad styles be objectively ranked according to how well they encapsulate or communicate ideas. The interminable parade of apples was, in essence, just me sitting through a class on realistic still life painting, taught by a dozen humorless authoritarians who assured me that I'd never amount to anything if I couldn't replicate their bloody fruit bowl just so. And truthfully, I could have done without any of it, even though I do happen to lean towards hyperrealism in my mind's eye. Out there somewhere, though, is a Monet of visualization who continues to beat herself over the head trying to mimic the default style of the age when, in order to really blow the lid off her practice, she should be letting herself paint the scenes that come naturally. So too is there a fellow on the aphantasic end of the visualization spectrum who's quite literally been told that he doesn't have what it takes to take on witchcraft because his mind's eye is blind. Clearly, I have a lot to say about how much I dislike the majority of instructional guides on visualization. How about I try my hand at having something more helpful to say instead? Sure thing. And to do so, I suggest we ditch all our talk about visualization per se and discuss instead what that visualization is supposed to achieve. Can we talk about the ends without getting bogged down in the supposed how-tos and should-nots of the sensory process? And in so doing, can we nail down what we think the mechanics of our own most successful visualization approaches actually entail? I think so, and I'll give it a shot in my next video. Until later then, a wonderful afternoon to you all.